Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome and we're so glad to have you. Most of my newest viewers have probably joined from my incredibly popular video last week with the sneak preview of the Magus. So first things first, a big thank you to Paizo for letting me preview Magus that way. It has been fantastic for my channel. It's become the most viewed video I have ever released, and it's caused a bunch of you to come out here and hang out on this channel. If you like what you saw in that video, consider purchasing Impossible Magic. It looks like it's shaping up to be the best book they've ever released, and I don't use that lightly. Paizo has had some fantastic releases before, and I think Impossible Magic might blow all of them out of the water. This week and next are going to have a lot of previews from me about various parts of Impossible Magic once I have my hands on the full PDF, and it looks to me like there's a lot for me to talk about. That being said, this video is not an Impossible Magic preview. This video is a continuation of my Marshall series. But on the topic of all my newest viewers, I figured I should give a little bit of an introduction. This channel is an optimization-focused channel, 99% of the time optimizing Pathfinder 2nd Edition, though we do talk about other games from time to time. And one of the key ingredients of this channel's optimization is that I like to go beyond what DPR analysis, White Room math show us. I'm not just interested in making the average number go up as much as possible. I want to take a deeper look. I want to see how things that are not damage behave in certain circumstances. I want to see different textures of the same damage and how they behave, and I want to see how all of these things interact with different parties. And if you're new here and you go through this channel's history, you're going to find a lot of spellcasting focused videos, and I do think they've had a positive impact on online discourse about spellcasters, and more recently I have been in a Marshall focused arc. And this video is about one specific Marshall, the Investigator, and we will get into that in a second. And of course, all this talk of new viewers shouldn't mean that I don't value my returning viewers. Some of y'all have been around since my very first few videos, and many others have been around for months or even a year at this point. And a big thank you to all of you for coming back week after week as I ramble about math and game design. Without you, this channel wouldn't be what it is. So to everyone, old viewers and new, if there's anything you would like me to do differently, please feel free to leave a comment, either on this video or on any of my other videos or posts. And if you'd like to see this channel keep going, please make sure to like and comment on videos. Engagement boosts views, and views mean I get to create more content for you. Now that we're through that overly long preamble, let's get into it. Now, when talking about the Investigator, we need to talk about Devise a Strategem. And of course, Strategic Strike, the feature that feeds off of it. And this is the key defining feature of the Investigator. Talking about Devise a Stratagem and Strategic Strike is like talking about the Barbarian's Rage, but for the Investigator, or talking about the proficiency bonus that fighters get. It is the defining aspect that explains to you and signposts to you how you're supposed to interact with the rest of the game while you're playing an Investigator. And unfortunately, there's one incredibly easy mistake you can make with it. That is to compare it to the Rogue's Sneak attack, or to a lesser extent, the Swashbuckler's Finishers mechanic. But we will talk about Finishers in a future video. That's not a topic for this video. Superficially, the Rogue and the Investigator have the same gameplay loop, and heavy emphasis on those scare quotes I used when I said the same. The first step is that you do a thing to enable your extra damage. The Rogue is just supposed to set up off guard in some way, and the Investigator is supposed to use Devise a Stratagem. And then the second step is that now you will have extra damage that comes in the form of d6's worth of precision damage. And this is where the superficial similarity sets in, because they both start at 1d6 and they both grow to 2d6 at level 5, and then after that, the Investigator is going to scale slightly faster and eventually slightly higher, but because they start off with identical scaling, and they're both precision damage, and they both use this sort of an action tax, they end up looking similar. And this is compounded by the fact that they have a similar class chassis. For example, you'll notice that there are the two classes in the game that are Skill monkeys buy their class chassis. They each get twice as many skill increases and twice as many skill feats as any other class. And between these superficial similarities, the actual structural similarities between the class chassis of being skill monkeys and the superficial similarities of the damage and gameplay loops, it is really easy to make the mistake of evaluating the Investigator as just being a worse rogue, or even a side-graded rogue. Not everyone who makes this mistake then thinks the Investigator is weak, but they do still think it is very similar to the rogue in many meaningful ways and just achieving the same goal in a different way. Now, here is my claim for this video, and the majority of this video is going to focus on this claim, and at the end we will also talk about other aspects of the Investigator that go beyond just damage and devise a stratagem. My claim is that devise a stratagem is secretly a spike damage tool. If you're not sure what I mean by spike damage, I define damage as coming from one of two buckets. Continuous damage is the one where you're trying to do reliable, efficient damage round after round, whereas spike damage is when you're trying to take a risk and spike a huge amount of damage at once, even if your average damage over time might be lower than, say, continuous damage. And the thing is, because of its superficial similarity to a rogue, the Investigator's strategic strike gets compared to continuous damage tools, because sneak attack is a continuous damage tool. The rogue is meant to try and get the enemy off guard and then deliver round after round of reliable damage to the enemy. And the rogue is great at that. You'll see that the rogue is just a good continuous damage dealing class. Perhaps a little worse at range, but certainly in melee it is fantastic at its job. And because the Investigator's spike damage tool is now being compared to a continuous damage tool, it comes out looking worse. Because remember, spike damage must lose a DPR contest for continuous damage to be relevant. If you don't agree with this argument, I highly recommend you check out my Vicious Swing video linked above, because I don't just build off this argument in this video, I build off almost everything I mentioned in the Vicious Swing video, so it's a really good idea to check that one out, at least briefly, before coming back to this one. But the gist is that if spike damage and continuous damage have the same average damage, spike damage is just better because you can set up for it to reach even higher peaks that continuous damage will never approach. The goal of spike damage must be to have higher peaks, but continuous damage must have the generally higher floor and average case. So let's analyze devise a stratagem from a spike damage lens rather than a continuous damage one. So to begin to analyze devise a stratagem as a spike damage tool, let us first enter an alternate universe, one where devise a stratagem does not exist, not in its current form, and instead, strategic strike is worded this way. It is a 2-action ability that says, you make a strike with a finesse, agile, or ranged weapon. This strike deals an additional 1d6 precision damage. Increase the number of dice by 1 at 5th level, 9th, 13th, and 17th levels respectively. Now this is obviously a spike damage tool. It is worded and templated exactly the same as Vicious Swing. Instead of using one action to make a strike and then potentially have one more action for another strike or some other auxiliary action, you're spending 2 actions on your strike, with the reward being added damage. This is an obvious spike damage tool. This is how spike damage is templated. Vicious Swing, Spell Strike, Megaton Strike, Tiger Slash, etc. But this is obviously better than Vicious Swing in many different and meaningful ways. It works at a range. It does not depend on the weapon damage dice at all, so you can use a small die weapon with it or a big die, whatever suits your playstyle or party role best. It also scales quite a bit more smoothly because Vicious Swing scales at 10th level and then 18th level. There are big gaps where it's slowly falling off without getting an additional die of damage. And finally, right at the top end, it scales a little bit higher in terms of the absolute damage delivered. For those of you that have played Starfinder 2nd Edition, it is very similar to the Boost trait in that game. Except, of course, Boost is an interact action you use before you make a strike and lasts till the end of your next turn. I'll one day talk about Boost perhaps, but Strategic Strike is vaguely analogous to boost, and is obviously a spike damage tool. Now remember, in my last video, I did establish that Vicious Swing is worth using. Some of you even said that the video did not convince you it was worth using because it costs a feat. But this doesn't even cost a feat. So at a baseline, this thing that is arguably an upgrade, definitely a side grade at least, compared to Vicious Swing, should be worth using if you're getting it for free, if you're not spending a feat on it, right? And just to really drive the point home of how Strategic Strike, this hypothetical version, compares to Vicious Swing, here is a chart showing their damage progress. I am only considering on-hit damage. I am not accounting for accuracy here. I am not accounting for crits here. And remember that I am using this hypothetical strategic strike that I established in the previous slide. The x-axis is the level range, 1 till 20. The y-axis, the height of each of these charts, basically, represents the ratio that your added spike damage is compared to the base damage of your weapon. So as an example, if you're a level 1 fighter using Vicious Swing, then your average damage on a hit without Vicious Swing was d10 plus strength, which is 9.5. Vicious Swing adds another d10, which is 5.5, so the ratio would be 5.5 divided by 9.5, which is around 0.57-ish. That analysis repeated for all three cases, levels 1 till 20. I have accounted for things like striking runes and weapon specialization correctly throughout these charts, and I have assumed that there is a plus 1d6 damaging property rune at levels 8, 10, and 16, respectively. There are 3 lines on this chart. The orange line is Vicious Swing with a d10 weapon from the fighter. The green line is the hypothetical strategic strike, but with a d8 finesse weapon. I did not find a finesse weapon larger than d8. I will also note that while for the orange line, the Vicious Swing one, I assumed maxed out strength, so plus 4 at level 1 and plus 7 at level 20, for the green line, I'm assuming progressing but not nearly maxed out strength. So it starts at plus 1 strength at level 1, and it ends at plus 4 strength by level 15. And finally, the blue line is Strategic Strike, but with a short bow. I assume no strength here. This is not a composite short bow. This is just a regular short bow. And obviously, since this is just on hit damage, deadly is not being accounted for. And this sort of clearly shows the point I'm raising in the previous slide. Strategic Strike, this hypothetical version of it, is just a little better than Vicious Swing, isn't it? There are many level ranges where you're dealing absolutely higher damage than Vicious Swing, because you're just adding more d6's worth of damage than Vicious Swing would be adding d10s. But even at the levels where you're not dealing absolutely more damage, you're still dealing relatively more, even on a melee weapon, simply because the weapon damage die you're using is smaller. Investigators do smaller damage on a hit compared to a fighter because they don't get to max out strength almost certainly. Even if you're not starting at plus 1, you're never going to get to plus 4, and you're probably not starting at plus 3, in my opinion. And they don't even get to use d10 weapons. So between all those factors, the Investigators' hit damage is progressing slower, which means their spikes are worth more. And this is most obvious on the blue line, the short bow one, where in the first half of the level range, you're either actually doubling your damage or nearly doubling your damage for many of the different levels. And in the second half, it evens out to still being much more of a relative spike damage increase. So remember, if you buy my argument that Vicious Swing is at a baseline, a decent spike damage tool, and I really do think it is, especially if you're not spending a feat on it, then Strategic Strike is also at least decent, probably a little bit better than that. This hypothetical Strategic Strike, that is. Now, let's leave the realm of the hypothetical Strategic Strike and talk about the real one, the one that gets much better than the hypothetical because of Devise, a stratagem. Effectively, what Devise tells you is this. You get to have that previously established 2-action spike damage option. You use Devise, you roll high enough to hit, you then use a second action to strike, and you get that spike in damage. But if you were to miss, especially if you missed by an obviously low number, you are refunded one of those two actions. You never have to make that second action to strike. You simply used Devise, saw a low roll, and did not spend your second action. Now, this is not going to have 100% certainty. Sometimes you will miscalculate. You might roll a natural 10 and then think you might hit, and then it turns out that you miss. But most of the time, you will have a good gauge of what is going to be the outcome of your roll, what sorts of benefits it needs, especially later and later into a combat. By the later points of a combat or against an enemy you have faced before, you might know within ±1 what the enemy's AC is and be able to exactly figure out how to hit them if needed. And that refund is sort of the crucial part of Devise, a stratagem, except Devise is even better than just being a simple action refund. Because if you took that hypothetical strategic strike I talked about and added a line that said, if you miss, you are refunded one action, you would still waste any supplementary actions you spent on that spike. Spike damage users tend to build a lot of value into that one action if they can. As a simple example, you might use some sort of a consumable to boost that 2-action strike you took. And if you then miss, that consumable activation is also wasted. You spent an action on it and the consumable is presumably gone. But an investigator never needs to take a supplementary action that's going to go to waste. You will only ever use those actions when you know you have rolled well enough to hit. And that carves out the investigator's niche in terms of its martial damage feature. Typically, spike damage is high risk, high reward. This can be seen in relation to just making strikes and using a typical class damage boost, like the fighter's proficiency or the barbarian's rage or the rogue's sneak attack. When you make a lot of strikes, typically you have a relatively high floor because some of those strikes are going to hit, so you have a higher floor and average, but your ceiling is not that high, especially due to the multiple attack penalty, unless you get tons of support. Spike damage stretches out that band. It worsens your floor, worsens your average, but improves your ceiling because now you have a high chance of missing, but also a high chance of hitting with increased damage. And the investigator's defining feature is that they are a spike damage class that has low risk spike damage. Compare this to a class like the Magus, or even classes like the Inventor or Monk or Fighter that have optional 2-action spike damage features like Megaton Strike or Vicious Swing or Tiger Slash. Generally speaking, if you use 2 actions and miss, you simply miss. But the investigator will only have spent 1 action and thus have much more of their turn's value left, double what the others get to have, provided they don't make an attack against the same target. And of course, there is the factor that Devise, a stratagem, will sometimes be a free action. Maybe it'll be a lot of times at your table. There is a degree of table variance to it, which I will get into near the end of this section of the video, but it's definitely going to happen some of the time, especially if you have the person of interest feat. So the investigator gameplay loop has 2 parts to it. How do I maximize predicted spikes in damage, maximize the value I get out of them, and how do I minimize the turns where I predicted a low roll? How do I still get good value out of my turn, even though I now know I won't get to spike a good amount of damage? And the push and pull, the tug of war between these two is what makes the investigator worth playing. If you don't want to engage in this tug of war, it's simply not a good idea to play the investigator. This class was made for it. This class's whole gimmick is wanting you to play with this predictive aspect of the gameplay. If you don't want to engage with it, a mastermind rogue, a commander, both of these make for good intelligence marshals that don't have to engage in this predictive gameplay loop. But if you play an investigator, you need to be thinking of these 2 factors. So let's first talk about maximizing your high rolls, maximizing the turns where you know you're going to deal spike damage. And let's establish right away, if you do nothing to make your turn better, you are already spiking good damage. Strategic Strike is good spike damage. It already landed above Vicious Swing with no predictive aspects, no specific optimizations added to it. And this is great because it means if you have a middling roll, like say a natural 11 or 12, and you're not quite sure that you're going to be spiking high damage, simply don't invest more into it. Just take your strike and then use your third action as something else that is useful, like demoralize or recall knowledge or anything of the sort. And of course, the easiest and most baseline way of maximizing strategic strike damage is Insight Coffee, which is a consumable that specifically calls out the Investigator and gives them a damage upgrade. D6s become D8s in your strategic strike. Now, I hate that this item exists, really. I don't think items that are so bespoke and so narrow should ever get published in like a random item book like Treasure Vault. But the item does exist, and if you're playing an Investigator, it is a really good idea to use it, especially if you're using the alchemical sciences methodology, which can pretty much get it for free because it has a long duration. But let us move beyond just the damage of Strategic Strike and look at other factors too. One big way to maximize your high rolls is actually Athletic Strategist, and this is sort of where melee Investigators start getting really good. If you think of just the spike damage aspects, and even some of the other factors I mentioned on this slide, you're going to come to the conclusion that Investigators should usually operate at range. And maybe if previously you thought that Investigators have no niche over the Rogue, you might now think that the Rogue is the melee sneak attack character and the Investigator is the ranged sneak attack character. And while that is an oversimplified and somewhat valid way of looking at things, Investigators have good reasons to go into melee as well, and Athletic Strategist is definitely one of them. If you're going to roll high and you keep the option for grappling open, you can just restrain an enemy, and this can be devastating against the right sort of foe. And I think this feat is good enough on its own to make melee Investigators worth doing. Remember, maximizing a Devise Strategem roll is not just about damage. If you're able to get this huge amount of control out of it, it just gets even better. And then there is Shared Stratagem and Didactic Strike. Shared Stratagem is a small upgrade to your Devise Stratagem, which then makes the enemy off guard to one of your allies. And Didactic Strike makes it even better because now it makes them off guard to multiple of your allies, and each of them deals additional precision damage the first time they hit this enemy. Didactic Strike, of course, is a high-level feat, level 16, but Shared Stratagem on its own is still good if you have another ally who might need your help for getting off guard. Which might be the case, because if you're, say, a ranged Investigator, there might be a melee marshal in the party who is not getting a flanking buddy. Also notably, Shared Stratagem does work on all attack rolls, not just strikes, so you can use this to set up a spellcaster in your party as well, because spell attacks can be really good when used with setup. And that is a good baseline discussion of what you can achieve for maximizing high rolls within your character sheet, within your class, plus this one weird item that seems to reference your class for some reason. But let's go beyond that. Let's start talking about items. One of the best ways for ranged Investigators to maximize high Devise rolls is magical ammunition and alchemical ammunition. The two most obvious examples being Rhino Shot in magical ammunition and elemental ammunition for the alchemical side. Both of these are generically typed ammunition. You can use them for bows, crossbows, and arrows, and both of them are unconditional damage increases to your spikes. Rhino Shot is simply a plus 2d6. I know it has a fixed DC, but the DC does not impact the actual damage you deal. It only impacts the rider effect, which, without a rider effect, an additional 2d6 on an attack you already knew you were going to hit or crit is just great. And elemental ammunition is free persistent damage and splash damage on top of an attack that you knew would hit or crit. So both of these make a good enough baseline where any Investigator with no further thought can simply have a bunch of these in their pocket. And when they're making an attack with, say, a bow, and they roll high enough on Devise Stratagem, they simply activate the ammunition with one action, and then just add a bunch of damage to their already spiky shot, which means your spike damage just got higher and spikier. And you can go beyond this. You don't just have to add spike damage to your already good spike damage. You can add controlling and debuffing effects when you know you will hit. For example, you can use a bola shot to trip an enemy, you can use battering ammunition to shove an enemy, etc. I talked about a whole bunch of magical ammunition options in my Stop Building Boring Marshals video linked above, and every single one of them gets better assuming they have a 1-action activation, so not the 2-action ones, but the 1-action activation ones among them get much better when you know that that action is going to go to a good roll. And in fact, every single consumable gets better when you know it won't go to waste. For example, here is a funny thing literally any investigator can do. If you devise a stratagem and roll a natural 20, simply pull out a fatal weapon like a gun and just take a shot at the enemy and let that fatal damage be a huge spike that others won't really be able to add using their action economy. If you're not rolling natural 20s, simply don't use the gun. Just use whatever other weapon you have. And because you're using this gun so rarely, it doesn't need to be engraved with real potency and striking runes. You can just put potency crystals on them, because when you're only using this weapon like 2 or 3 times over the course of a potency crystal's lifetime before it gets obsolete, you're saving like so much gold, because potency crystals are like 10 times cheaper than their corresponding +1 striking pair of runes. So your main weapon, for example, might just not have the fatal trait, and this is your fully runed up weapon. This is the one you use when your Devise stratagem is somewhere between 9 and 18 or whatever. But when you get those rolls you know will crit, you just swap to a fatal weapon that happens to have a potency crystal, and you'll use it once in that combat, won't need to do so again until the next combat in which you roll a crit. And this is just one funny use case of a consumable. If you dig through the items available to you, I promise you're going to find so many different things. Melee investigators will probably benefit from talismans that can really upgrade what they can do, or whetstones perhaps, because there are whetstones that also increase your damage. And again, I talk about a lot of these items in my Stop Building Boring Marshals video. And if you look at this part of this slide and you're like, I don't want to use items to maximize my damage, I don't want to use gimmicks like that, in that case, the Investigator might genuinely not be the class for you, because the Investigator's character fantasy is sort of like the Batman or Sherlock Holmes fantasy. You're not really supposed to be relying on just what's on your character sheet. You should be always locked in on the environment, on other tools you can use, and items and consumables are a huge and valuable part of that. The Investigator has multiple lines of feats designed to reward item usage, for example, so you really should be considering consumables as part of your class feature package, because they interact so well with what you can do when you predict a good roll. And if you're not interested in that, you should consider perhaps playing another intelligence-based martial, like a commander or a mastermind rogue. And finally, there's always the option of picking up more spike damage from archetypes. The 2 classic examples being, you can pick up Vicious Swing via, say, the Mauler archetype, and there are 2-handed finesse weapons that you can use the Mauler archetype on, or you can pick up Spell Strike via the Magus archetype, and a single Spell Strike, when you know you're gonna roll high, is one of the highest spikes of damage you can possibly get in this game. And I know archetypes get used as an argument against the Investigator, because people argue you should archetype in to devise a stratagem, but I don't think that's an apples to apples comparison, because the Investigator can also archetype out of Investigator if they want to increase the magnitude of their spikes. When you combine everything an Investigator can do on their spikes, the already good strategic strike damage, the feats that add some value passively or give you a new mode for your strategy options, the consumables, especially magical ammunition that can just either raw increase your damage or add a whole bunch of riders to what you would otherwise have done. And finally, the ability to archetype into spike damage options from other classes and non-multiclass archetypes. Between all of those, the Investigator is capable of some of the highest highs in the game, while not having the worst lows. And then we need to talk about actually minimizing low rolls. Low rolls are simply a reality of using Devise stratagem. 50% of your rolls are going to be 10 or lower, and a solid 25% of your rolls are going to be 5 or lower. You are going to have low rolls. And this isn't an aspect of the Investigator that gets talked about enough. People do talk about trying to land those spikes with the high rolls. Even the ones who don't evaluate Investigator as a spike damage class still intuitively understand that if you can lock in a high roll, you want to spell strike with it and something of the sort, and suggest that as one of the many options. For example, But minimizing low rolls is as crucial as maximizing your high ones. And in the worst, most extreme cases, I have seen comments in the online discourse where some folks, and this is, I know, a small minority, but they still exist, some folks saying that they basically treat Devise a Strategem as a one action tax to then enable their strike. And if they roll low, they just miss with that strike. They just make that strike anyways, knowing they will miss, and then make a third strike. So effectively, they sort of treat this like a mandatory version of, say, Hunt Prey or the Inventor's Overdrive action, where it's like you use your action tax and then you make 2 strikes. But fundamentally, this is worse than any other Marshal's action tax if you play the Investigator this way. Let's say you're an Inventor. You roll low on Overdrive, for example. You don't get a damage bonus, but you still get 2 rolls for your strikes that come after. So Overdrive, fail or crit fail, and then strike is actually still a functional Marshal turn. But as an Investigator, if your Devise a Stratagem rolled low, and then you just use the strike anyways to clear it, you wasted your time. So you need real strategies for what you do when your Devise roll is low. And there are many options, both within the class and outside the class. So the baseline options, the one any Investigator should be able to take, are as follows. The first is simply attacking a different target. And this is an option that is going to be present on the majority of turns of the majority of combats. If your GM's encounters are not purposely geared towards single bosses, you are definitely going to fight more encounters with multiple enemies on the field. And so this makes a fantastic default option. And it pairs naturally with the idea of being a spike damage dealer. You attempt a spike on some enemy, you happen to roll low, you just switch targets, not really having wasted 2 of your actions. And you just switch to like not as good, but still decent level of Marshal damage on some other target. And then your other option is Skill Stratagem. And Skill Stratagem, its benefit is much more marginal. It mostly just exists so that when you fight a single boss enemy, you're not just screwed out of having baseline options. So it boosts your skill checks, and as an Investigator, you will have good skill checks unless you built weirdly, because you have twice as many skill increases as everyone else. But this is a marginal benefit. It will be what you default to if there's only one enemy left on the field, but it can't be something you actually rely on. These are the baseline options. But beyond that, your feats also give you a few options. Certain Stratagem is actually pretty good. It is a level 2 feat that deals half your strategic strike damage, only the additional portion of it, the precision, on a miss, but not a critical miss. And this is a pretty good floor to assign your strategic strike. If there's only one target left, there are going to be many cases where this is a better option than Skill Stratagem. That being said, you can't just rely on this, because again, then you're just falling into that pattern of making action tax strike as your turn, and that's not a very good turn for the Investigator. Certain Stratagem is a useful option to have, but it's very much a slightly better floor for your performance than Skill Stratagem. You still want to try and avoid the floor altogether if possible. The next up is Defensive Stratagem, and this is actually a pretty good option, especially against bosses. Boosting your saving throws and your AC against a boss that you rolled low against is just a fundamentally good thing to be able to do. Now we can talk about a few options that are a little more outside your class. First, you could try using an alchemical bomb or something of the sort for splash damage, anything that has something useful when you roll low. Notably, the alchemical bomb pairs really well with certain stratagem because now you're doing a little bit of splash damage and you're doing half your strategic strike damage if you miss without critically missing, and then the splash also has the AoE factor attached to it. And really, the alchemical bomb is just one specific example, but you can just use any relevant consumable. So for example, let's say you devise a stratagem and you rolled a very low number. Now you know you're going to miss on this turn anyways. Treat it as a setup turn. Pull out and drink a misform elixir or numbing tonic or something to set up for your future turns. turns where you roll low on your Devise a Stratagem can sometimes just open up windows proactively for you. And your gut instinct might honestly tell you that this is not a good strategy because you're sort of wasting tempo on setup, but you're not really wasting tempo. You're spending one action to know that your second action's worth of tempo would have been wasted. And then you're not wasting that second action. You're instead spending that action on something else that matters. So really, despite this looking like bad tempo, it's actually really good downside mitigation for a low roll that you foresaw on Devise a Stratagem. Then, of course, there's the option of using a saving throw-based offense. And I will admit, I do have a small criticism of the Investigator's class here, that I wish they had more ways of targeting saving throws built into the class so that they had another good, obvious high floor option for minimizing low rolls. Obviously, the only Investigator that natively gets a good way of doing this is the Palatine Detective Investigator, because you get an Occult Cantrip at a baseline. And that Occult Cantrip can be Void Warp, which targets every living creature. But of course, any Investigator can just choose to archetype into Magus for 2 cantrips, and those cantrips can be better than Void Warp. They can be, say, Electric Arc and Frostbite, and now you have 2 saving throws covered that you can target if you know that your strike is going to miss. And the reason I say Magus here rather than, say, Wizard or Witch, either of the other 2 intelligence spellcasters, is because if you archetype into the Magus, you are now leaving open the option later on of picking up Spell Strike to go back to maximizing the high rolls that we talked about in the last slide. Magus gives you both a way to minimize your low rolls and maximize your high rolls, and that's pretty fantastic. But of course, the biggest thing that any Investigator, regardless of subclass, can do, though some subclasses excel at more, is switching to a more supportive role for the turn. And again, some people view this as bad tempo because rather than making strikes like a marshal should, you have now switched to a supportive role or something more setup oriented. But it's not bad tempo. It is you having not spent 2 actions on something that would have been a waste of time, and instead only having spent 1 action on it, and still having 2 actions left to do something else. And this can involve any number of different things. Investigators have doubled skill progression and skill feat progression. Their skill feat progression is a little more restricted than the rogues because it has to correlate to certain attributes, but ultimately you still have twice as many skill feats as a standard class, and twice as many skill increases. So by level 20, you could potentially have 6 legendary skills, and you could have a whole bunch of skill feats. And I talked about this in my overarching marshals video, where skills and skill feats are a great way for marshals to interact with the battlefield in ways that are not strikes. You could pick up any number of different options. Demoralized is a fantastic baseline, and it's not going to hurt you to have a little bit of charisma on your Investigator, despite how multiple attribute dependent you are, especially if you're operating at range. Any of the recall knowledge skills are fantastic options for you too. Forensic Investigators are fantastic medicine users, and Interrogator Investigators are good at using diplomacy for both their own class options as well as external diplomacy factors like, say, Bon Mot. And you can pick up other relevant skill feats like Distracting Performance or Additional Lore. Skill actions can really round out your turn, and one funny thing is, remember on the previous slide I talked about how melee investigators can pick athletic strategists to maximize their high rolls for stuff like grappling, tripping, shoving, etc. If you don't pick athletic strategists, then you can use it to minimize your low rolls instead. Because if you roll low on a strike and don't have athletic strategist, you won't be forced to use that roll on the first attack trait action you make. You can just go and make an athletics roll, try to grapple someone, try to reposition someone, try to shove someone, trip someone, etc. So all sorts of investigators, melee and range, should have plenty of options for minimizing their low rolls. This can use items, this can use skills, this can use spells, any combination of different things. And as always, at a baseline, you can just strike a different target, and that is going to be your floor for the majority of combats. Skill stratagems, certain stratagem, and defensive stratagem are really only your floor for single boss fights. For most other combats, attacking a different target is your floor, and all of these other options, you will use them because you think they might be better than attacking a different target. And that is how you deal with the interplay between the high rolls and the low rolls of Devise a Stratagem. And finally, there is one more important factor to address when talking about Devise a Stratagem, a question that haunts investigator optimization discourse everywhere I have seen. How frequently is Devise a Stratagem going to be a free action for you? Setting aside, of course, person of interest, which is objectively codified and will enable a free action when you use it, there is another way to get Devise as a free action. If you are aware that a creature could help answer the question at the heart of one of your active investigations, you are allowed to use Devise a Stratagem on them as a free action. And active investigations is something that is up to GM fiat. Some GMs might have a pretty simplistic and loose definition of investigations. If, for example, you find some tracks, they might say that simply wanting to know whom those tracks belong to is an active investigation, and then in combat you can devise that creature until you have identified everything there is to know about that creature type, for example. But others might just say that there needs to be something larger than who is that for active investigations to be relevant for Devise a Stratagem. Likewise, I have seen some GMs interpret answer the question to be literally answer the question, like that creature needs to speak to you in a language you understand and answer your question. And I do think that's way too strict of a reading of the word answer. But still, if you're playing with a GM like that, you're almost certainly not going to be able to use Devise a Stratagem unless you're playing a campaign with a lot of mysteries that you directly need to interrogate a suspect for. And still others have really vague definitions of answer, which can apply to pretty much anything pertaining to a creature, in which case you'll use it all the time. There is a huge degree of variance to this. There is no one right answer. And the truth is that anyone who tells you that they have an approximate idea of how frequently it's going to come up is just extrapolating from their own table experiences. There can't be one answer. If there were, we wouldn't really be playing a TTRPG. The whole reason we play a tabletop role-playing game is, at least partially, for the GM variance. We want a human to be in control of the NPCs and the environment and the world building and the narrative, and that means that these sorts of things are always going to be a factor. This is not a bug. It is a feature. The table variance is going to exist, and I promise you, if you talked to a Paizo designer and said that there's a huge degree of table variance to how good or bad the investigators devise a stratagem is, they would say, yeah, we made the investigator so they feel rewarded in certain campaigns, and this is not a mistake. I will be doing a deeper dive into situational options and variance in detail in some future video, because this is a relevant topic. This devise a stratagem problem exists in multiple forms. The Ranger's Hunt Prey has it. The Slayer has a few features that have it. And table variance extends to well beyond that, the most common example being, of course, prepared and spontaneous spellcasters. But for the sake of this video, I think it's just fair to say, if a table or campaign that you're in don't reward you pursuing investigations outside of combat, you should not be bringing an investigator to them. Online advice that isn't aware of your table and your table's dynamics, and especially white room advice, can really only go so far. Bring it to tables it'll be good at, but if you're playing in a campaign where you get the vibe that you're just going to walk up to doors, kick down the doors, and whack everyone behind those doors with little to no preparation, tracking, mystery, etc., you shouldn't bring an investigator to those tables. And of course, at the table you do bring investigators to, there's still a big burden of being proactive about this on you. The GM is not always going to put a mystery before you. Sometimes the GM just put a creature there because there's a creature there. But you can still seek out mysteries about it. You can chit-chat with other players. You can ask somebody to scout. You can use feats like Battle Planner or Survey Wildlife to enable opportunities to find creatures whom a mystery might pertain to. Ultimately, at no table can you rely on Devise a Stratagem being a free action, aside from, of course, person of interest, but at some tables, it will happen a decent amount of time. At some tables, it'll happen occasionally, and at some tables, it'll happen not at all. you probably shouldn't play an investigator at that last kind of table because you're just not going to feel rewarded for a huge chunk of your toolkit. But the other tables, bring an investigator, have a good plan for devise a stratagem when it costs an action, and when it doesn't cost an action, you will feel even more rewarded for it. And with that, we are done talking about devise a stratagem. And it took up the brunt of this video because it is your main gameplay defining feature. Everything else you do is rounding out what you are as an investigator, but devise a stratagem is what defines your niche. But there is another important aspect to what investigators do. Recall knowledge and keen recollection is a major part of that, alongside, of course, your accelerated skill increases. Keen recollection is a somewhat controversial feature. The rules say that it lets you use any untrained skill for recall knowledge and add your level to the bonus if you wouldn't otherwise add your proficiency bonus to it. And this seems simple on the surface, but the reason it seems controversial is because all features and feats designed this way don't draw any exclusion for lores, and lores are theoretically open-ended. They can be as narrow as you want, so long as they never get broader than a single skill. So the question becomes, can you use it to use a lore pertaining to the target? Can an investigator fight a bog dragon and say, I am using dragon lore for my keen recollection and add their level to it? And the benefit of this is that when you use a lore that is applicable to a situation, you usually benefit from some kind of a DC reduction. And in fact, there is an argument to be made of, is the investigator allowed to use bog dragon lore, which is more applicable and thus would presumably benefit from a larger DC reduction? My ballpark tends to be that a slightly applicable lore usually gets a -2, whereas a really specific lore would get a -5. So say dragon lore would get -2 and bog dragon lore would get -5. And then there's the added layer of complexity where should you be allowed to use a lore for a creature that you didn't already have as like from another feature, like you don't explicitly have dragon lore? Can you use dragon lore to identify a bog dragon? Probably. Everyone knows what a dragon is. But would you know to identify it with bog dragon lore, even if you could add your level to it? Like, do you have to first succeed on dragon lore and then you can use bog dragon lore? It is honestly poorly templated in my opinion. That being said, I simply allow keen recollection to benefit from actually using highly specific lore. So benefiting from like a -5 to the DC. And I will explain why after I do my mathematical analysis. And I want to be clear, I would not hand the same benefit to untrained improvisation. One of the biggest arguments against keen recollection getting this treatment is that untrained improv being given this treatment would sort of trivialize a lot of intelligence-based classes' niches. And I do agree. So I wouldn't give untrained improv the same treatment. They are worded identically, but one is a class feature at level 3 that only one class can pick, and that class uses intelligence as a key attribute and is designed with recall knowledge synergies in mind. The other is a general feat anyone can pick. So even though they're worded identically, and it is technically inconsistent to rule one way and the other way, untrained improvisation at my tables must use predefined skills, whereas keen recollection is allowed to use specific lores and get -5 DC reduction from it. And on the next slide, I hope my math convinces you that this is not an issue. Now, the mathematical analysis is basically a many-way comparison of different ways of progressing the investigator bonus to recall knowledge. Some of them more unambiguous, and some of them based on keen recollection's various interpretations, so I can sort of draw a feel for where the investigator should sit. First is the investigator using an applicable additional lore. This means you get a -2 DC reduction pretty much unambiguously. This is like saying you paid attention to the campaign pitch, picked up dragon lore with additional lore ahead of time, like you actually spent your skill feat on it, and now you have come across a bog dragon. There is no ambiguity to it. You have a lore that is applicable to the situation. You will get a benefit to your check that would be a little better than a normal recall knowledge check. I will note here that the proficiency for this is automatically maxed out because the additional lore skill fee auto-scales your proficiency for this. Your intelligence is also maxed out because you're an investigator and this is your key attribute. So I'm assuming 4 at level 1 up till 7 at level 20. And I am assuming that you are picking up a Brooch of Inspiration at the earliest levels possible. So 8, 11, and 17 for a +1, 2, or 3 item bonus to your recall knowledge checks with any lore skills you use. The any is important. It will come up for keen recollection later on. Then there is the Investigator progressing to Legendary in an intelligence-based skill, which means there's no DC reduction. This, again, is assuming maxed out proficiency bonus, levels 3, 7, and 15 for Expert, Master, and Legendary, respectively, and I'm assuming an item bonus that you can attain as frequently as possible. So I base this based on the first time you get a +1, 2, or 3 item bonus to any broad skill on the automatic bonus progression table. I will make a note here that a thaumaturge using esoteric lore should be tied with this nearly exactly. A little bit behind because the thaumaturge would also have to rely on the Brooch of Inspiration for their item bonus, but let's ignore that for now and just pretend they're able to apply item bonuses at automatic bonus progression levels. The thaumaturge would be tied with this. I know there is a small subsection of the community that believes that esoteric lore should benefit from a DC reduction, which would pull the thaumaturge ahead. In my opinion, that is an incorrect interpretation of the rules because the rules are pretty clear that the lore has to be actually uniquely applicable to the situation in a way a normal skill wouldn't. Since esoteric lore is broader than any normal skill, I wouldn't really say it applies. So if you're seeing a bog dragon, you're not getting a -2 DC reduction for an applicable lore. That being said, I know some folks like to go by the unspecific lore, specific lore construct that Archives of Nethys likes to use, treating esoteric lore as unspecific. If you are at a table that does so and your GM is not convinced by my argument that an applicable lore is not the same as a lore that is so broad that it applies to everything, then at the very least, the other investigator should also get a bump here, because if esoteric lore is an unspecific lore getting a -2 DC reduction, then it should pull ahead of the legendary skill that we're comparing it to here, but the additional lore investigator should then get a -5 DC reduction, because they definitely have a specific lore if you're considering esoteric lore unspecific, right? Make sure to chat with your GM about this. If an actually pertinent lore to the situation has the same DC reduction as esoteric lore, in my opinion, the GM is making a decision that nerfs intelligence-based classes in favor of the thaumaturge, and that is not something that needs to be done. The thaumaturge is fantastic. They're on this chart because without the DC reduction, they're still like one of the gold standards for how good recall knowledge gets. That's why I even made this note here. So just keep that in mind. Then the next thing I wanted to talk about would be the investigator, but progressing only to master in a skill and using wisdom rather than intelligence. In terms of the proficiency, I assume they're getting trained at level 1, expert by level 5, and master by level 9. This is reasonable for an investigator because the investigator does have accelerated skill progression. They will already have 2 master skills by the time they get to level 9, and this will be their 3rd. So it kind of makes sense that they would invest that in a bit of breadth if needed. Likewise, for item bonus, I assume they're only getting +1 and +2, and 2 levels later than the automatic bonus progression table would have let them get their earliest possible one. And again, no DC reduction. This is just a standard skill. Wisdom is improving at a rate of starting at +1 by level 1 and maxing out at +4 by level 15. This skill progression is sort of supposed to serve as the floor. The legendary in an intelligence skill with a maxed out item bonus is supposed to be the ceiling of what you can achieve without using a lore, with a predefined skill like Arcana or Crafting. And then this is sort of the floor. If you're not progressing up to master, especially as an investigator, you probably just don't plan to use that skill in combat. So I didn't feel the need of charting anything worse than master in a wisdom skill. I will also note here that the investigator item bonus is me lowballing ever so slightly. Cognitive mutagens, insight copies, all of these mean that the investigator can actually get ahead in item bonus than what I said, especially an alchemical sciences investigator. But we'll be ignoring that and just using normal item bonus progression. The next 3 cases will be the keen recollection ones, and they will all have identical bonuses. The only thing that changes is the DC reduction. So the bonus for a keen recollection investigator will be intelligence, which, as said, is being maxed out, and then the brooch of inspiration bonus, the item bonus, and of course the investigator's level itself, with no additional bonus on top of that. The first keen recollection case will be if you're allowed to use an applicable lore. You're fighting a bog dragon, you asked if you could use dragon lore, and your GM said yes. The second case will be a highly applicable lore. You're fighting a dragon that had black scales, and you asked your GM, I want to use bog dragon lore, and the GM said yes, that's a highly applicable lore. You get a -5 to the DC. And finally, an investigator who is not allowed to use lores at all. No DC reduction, you are only using a predefined skill, like nature or arcana or something of the sort. And a quick note I forgot to mention, the investigator using keen recollection for a predefined skill has no item bonus involved in their calculation. This is because you probably wouldn't have an item bonus to a skill that you're not even trained in. Maybe a +1 at the very highest level. Sometimes you get random +1 item bonuses you didn't know about, but I'm just assuming no item bonus. And the results are exactly as bad as you'd expect for that case. I will say that if I were in this 6th case, keen recollection but only predefined skills, I simply would not use wisdom skills in high level play, because at that point you're so far behind the expected curve of where you should be, because even a trained wisdom skill will have fallen off at this point and you're too behind that. So I would just not use wisdom based skills if my GM said only predefined skills. I would only use keen recollection for like random intelligence skills, which it'd be weird if I didn't have, because again, I am an intelligence class. I probably have all the intelligence skills. And this is what the math ends up looking like for our 6-way comparison. The x-axis is the level range, 1 up to 20. The y-axis, the height of each of these charts at any given point, tells you the natural d20 roll needed for you to beat a standard on-level DC for that level, given the DC reductions that your progression gives you. -2 for certain lores, -5 for highly applicable ones. So the 6 charts each account for the skill progressions we talked about in the previous slide and the DC reductions implicitly. Note here that since this is a natural d20 roll needed, a higher number is bad. If you're at a 14 on this graph, it means you need a 14 for a success and you critically fail on a 4. If you're at a 0 on this graph, that means you get a regular fail on a natural 1, not even a critical fail, and you get a success on a 2 and a critical success on a natural 11. Of the 6 charts, top to bottom, which means worst to best, these are what they are. The red line right at the top that never even gets close to any other line is what keen recollection with a predefined skill that you don't have an item bonus for gets you, even if it's always intelligence based. The orange line is keen recollection, but you're allowed to use applicable lores. So you're allowed to use dragon lore when you're fighting a bog dragon, but you're not allowed to say that you have bog dragon lore. So you're only getting a -2 DC reduction, not a -5. As you can see, this is a pretty bad line. Also note here that all of the keen recollection lines start at level 3. If they look like they start later, it's because they're tied with another line in that level range. So for example, the applicable keen recollection case is tied with the yellow line in levels 3 and 4. The yellow line is the master skill progression with a wisdom-based skill. And as you can see, as it goes down, it intertwines up and down with the white line. You will notice that the red line gets worse with levels, which is expected. It is known that even a trained skill will fall off over the levels. So a trained skill that has -2 relative to train will definitely fall off over the levels. The orange line will roughly stay the same throughout the levels. The yellow line is the first that, as you level up, gets better and better. And as you get into mid-level play, it starts catching up with the highly applicable keen recollection line and actually exceeds it for high-level play at levels 15 and higher. The white line, highly applicable keen recollection, is the one where you're allowed to use specific lores. So -5 because you fought a bog dragon with bog dragon lore. As you can see, it is neck and neck with the yellow line, but never really approaches the green line after level 6. It is tied levels 3 to 6, but starting at level 7, the green line is just cleanly ahead. The green line tracks legendary proficiency progression, maxed out intelligence, maxed out item bonus. This is what an investigator's maximally invested skill looks like when they're recall knowledging. And the blue line is additional lore, which is following roughly the same progression as the green line in terms of its bonus, with the item bonus being a little delayed, but it is always benefiting from a -2 to the DC, and this is unambiguous, and thus it is always ahead of the legendary line. And these 6 charts should show you why I rule Keen Recollection the way I do. Because the white line, the one where Keen Recollection is allowed to use a lore that is so applicable that you get a -5 to your DC, is still only barely keeping up with the yellow line, which tracks an investigator's not primary attribute with less than legendary progression and less than maxed out item bonus, and only barely keeps up with that line and falls behind it eventually anyways. The green line never falls behind the white line, and the blue line is even further ahead. And the green line sort of serves as an anchoring point for the whole distribution of lines, because that's also where the thaumaturge would sit, provided you don't give them the DC reduction, which I think is the correct ruling, and you don't account for the +1 circumstance or +1 status bonus which certain subclasses get, which I think is completely fair because the investigator also has a subclass that would give them bigger item bonuses to their recall knowledge checks, right? So it is evening out regardless. So the green line is what the investigator gets with fully investing in a skill. The blue line is what they get from a lore. They get additional lore in, the skill feat, to then react to their campaign in a specific way. And the white and yellow lines are what they get as a floor. These are their not so good lines. They're behind even their own best recall knowledge usage, and they're definitely behind other recall knowledge users, like the thaumaturge, or a high-level outwit ranger, or a commander, or a necromancer, or a slayer, each of whom have omnilores with certain restrictions. So if you rule that Keen Recollection is not allowed to use a very applicable lore, they're only allowed to use slightly applicable lores, like say Dragon lore but not Bog Dragon, then you're falling so far behind, it's worth questioning if Keen Recollection is even worth using. Look at how big the difference between the orange line and the green line is. It is a 3-point difference at its smallest between levels 4 to 6, and it grows all the way up to an 8-point difference, where additional lore succeeds on a natural 0 theoretically, which means because of the saturation rules, it technically still fails without crit failing on a natural 1, whereas the orange one succeeds on a natural 9. If you rule Keen Recollection that way, then I would say by around level 8 or so, Keen Recollection just stops being worth using. And if you rule it in the way where it's just not allowed to apply to anything other than a predefined skill, it's never worth using. It starts out at a 6-point difference, and it ends at a massive 13 to 14-point difference. That means it's just not worth using. It's terrible. And that is why I recommend ruling Keen Recollection in the white line way. And if you are playing with a GM who prefers one of the more constrained interpretations of Keen Recollection, show them this math. Show them how bad the interpretation causes Keen Recollection to be. Show them why your character may not be using that feature, and hopefully it'll convince them. And if you're a GM, I recommend ruling it in the more usable way for Keen Recollection. I do have a feeling that Paizo designers intended for you to be able to use lores with this, even if they did not intend for it with untrained improvisation. And I will say that if you allow Keen Recollection to track the white line, the Investigator is a fantastic recall knowledge user. Additional lore and being actually int-based means you will actually punch well above other classes if you are making sure you're picking lores that are pertinent to the campaign. The green line will be a pretty realistic middle-of-the-road performance for you because of your accelerated skill increases, and the yellow and white lines will serve as your floor, and that will make investigators feel good. That'll make them feel like they're actually studying their opponents and fighting that way. And that is all the analysis I have for the Investigator. We talked about their core combat defining feature, Devise a Strategem. We talked about how to use their diverse toolkit for dealing with the downsides of Devise a Stratagem, rolling a poor roll and being locked out of attacking a certain enemy. And we talked about Keen Recollection, which I think is an important part of their toolkit because Recall knowledge is both thematically fun on the Investigator and pretty powerful at a lot of tables I've played at, so it's definitely something you want to talk about and think about and optimize around if possible. Overall, I think the Investigator is a bit of an underrated class. It is definitely one of the more complex classes in the game, and its superficial similarities to other easier to play classes makes it easy to make the mistake that you're supposed to play it in a certain way and then be disappointed by it. But if you move past the instinct of trying to deal continuous damage with it, if you treat it as the spike damage class it is, and recognize that it is unique among spike damage classes in not having that bad of a downside, then it will feel fantastic at the table. And I promise you, you will have a lot of fun playing this engaging and varied and diverse and reactive playstyle that a lot of other martials can't really replicate. I do think a lot of the newer martials do have that reactive of a playstyle, something like an Exemplar, a Thaumaturge, or a Commander, or even a Guardian can get close. I do think the Investigator is pretty unique in how it gets that playstyle though. I've seen nothing like it in pretty much any game I have played, really. Even in Draw Steel, where martials generally tend to be very fun and varied and interesting, I have not really seen anything close to the Investigator in how it plays. That'll be all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I hope you like and comment. Every little bit of engagement helps the channel grow, and every bit of channel growth helps me get out the content that I want to deliver. If you'd like to see my future content, especially the rest of the Impossible Magic previews that I'll be sharing this week and the next, make sure to subscribe and click the channel notifications bell. And if you'd like to directly support me, consider joining a channel membership. And of course, try to support Paizo. Buy Impossible Magic, buy any of their books, because they are what keeps all of us content creators making content for you, and all of us as a community having fun with this game. Regardless, I hope I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.